Okay, well, it is 1 o'clock now. We have a lot to talk about today, and I want to make sure that we have enough time to get to everybody's questions. We have about 60 people thus far that have joined us on the webinar, 61, which is great. We had over 200 register, so we understand many might be joining us right now. I'm sort of keeping my eye on the list as we get going, but again, in an effort to ensure that we get to as many questions as possible, I would like us to begin now. So hello, everyone. My name is Evan Hawkins. I'm the Executive Director for the Faculty Association of California Community Colleges. Our president for our organization, Dr. Debbie Klein, is going to take the lead and start us off, and then we will start getting into our presentation on the budget. So Debbie, when you're ready. Debbie, can you hear me? We are having some sound technical difficulties right now. We'll get started in 1 second.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I hope so. All right. Well, I am having a hard time hearing Evan at the moment, but good afternoon, and thank you all for joining FACCC's first ever webinar. We're so happy to have you all here. I'm just going to say a few words about how the next hour will flow, and here it is. So we will start with Executive Director Evan Hawkins offering us an overview of the May revised proposals. Then we will answer questions that we received in advance of the webinar. And then we will answer the questions that you all send in the chat. So feel free to post your questions as we go, and then we'll conclude and have next steps. And a couple webinar ground rules just to get us started. Everyone will be muted, so please note that. And please turn off your video, if you will, just to keep our focus on the screen and on Evan. And then, as I said, the questions we received in advance will be taken first, and then the chat questions. And then we ask that you please be kind and respectful of each other, which we know you will be. And we'll have a hard stop at 2 today. So with that, Evan, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Debbie. And also, we see some comments in the chat. The chat will be private, but we will see your questions as we get to that portion of the day. So thank you so much, Debbie. I appreciate it. So I'm going to start with an overview of where we're at right now with the budget. So I'm going to kind of jump into it, spend some time here providing that overview for you all to give you an idea of what we're looking at here. And as you all probably have heard in the news, it's not a pretty picture in terms of what our budget deficit for our state is shaping up to be. So the number that the Department of Finance used, which is the number the governor used in his May revise from the other day, which came out on Thursday, which will be what we focus a bulk of this conversation about, is a $54 billion deficit. Now that deficit encompasses the current year and the next budget year as well. So for the next budget year, it's about a $40 billion deficit. Now that is based off of the January proposal from Governor Newsom. So it's not based off of current spending levels, but what the governor had hoped spending levels would be in the next budget year. So it's inflated a bit, but nonetheless, it paints a very painful picture for the state of our state when it comes to the budget. Now, our state is better positioned now than it had been for a recession. We had a rainy day fund of about $20 billion ready for a moment like this. Not all of it can be drawn at once, and about $8.3 billion will be drawn for the next budget year. So that's helpful to know for context. Something else in terms of the deficit that's important to know is that all these cuts have a trigger attached to them. Essentially, if the federal government does provide funding for the states to help alleviate the economic consequences of our public health crisis, then many of these cuts won't go into effect. Now, the expectation of the federal government doing this, I would say, is very low. Just today, the Trump administration is sort of signaling that they see a recovery, an economic recovery happening quickly, which Certainly I think there's a lot that would dispute that, many that would dispute that. However, that is the position they're taking at this moment, which makes me believe that they are not going to be necessarily pushing for an economic stimulus for states soon. They have already had a number of much pushback against that, despite the fact that the House of Representatives had passed legislation just last week that would provide help for our states. But nonetheless, I think that's important context, that there is the hope that the federal government could be helpful here to offset some of these cuts. And at the end of the webinar, we'll share some ways that you can engage in that conversation with our federal policymakers on this issue. But the big picture for our community colleges is something I wanted to highlight specifically here. So our system in the next budget year is looking at a $1.5 billion cut overall. This is a very large number, and it is the total amount that was cut from the community colleges in the entirety of the previous recession, the Great Recession. So that should tell you right there what we're looking at this moment. The specific cuts that will come from that, here are a few that I wanted just to highlight that are worth acknowledging now, and I'll get into some more details later on. We are looking at a $593 billion reduction in the student-centered funding formula. That is the main way that our colleges are funded in apportionment funding. This will obviously be a significant impact for our colleges and how they're funded. And it is approximately a 10% cut to what the governor proposed in January. And it's about an 8% cut to our current levels of revenue from the student-centered funding formula that our colleges are currently receiving. Now, I will get into a little bit later, because there's a question on this, how that breaks down on the specifics of the funding formula. A couple other things I wanted to mention. There was no apportionment COLA. There was in January. There is no enrollment growth funding anymore. And as of right now, the Department of Finance and the governor are not indicating that they want a workload reduction. We saw workload reduction 10 years ago during the recession. Right now, as it stands, the Department of Finance is not calling for that. And it actually wants to and has made a priority and emphasized that it wants our colleges to focus on access and serving all of our students during this time. There's some specific categorical cuts that are very troubling that I wanted to share. $135.6 million for strong workforce. This is a drastic cut to strong workforce funding, nearly a 60% cut overall. And that program now only has $100 million in funding. The Student Equity and Achievement Program is being cut by nearly $69 million, and that is a significant cut, about 14%. There are two cuts for part-time faculty support, $3.7 million for part-time faculty compensation, and $3.3 million for part-time faculty office hours. Respectively, that's a 15% cut on compensation and 27% on the part-time faculty office hours. And the Academic Senate for California Community Colleges is proposed to be cut $253,000. So these are some of the specific categorical cuts that were very concerning and are very concerning for our organization. Specifically, when we talk about the part-time faculty categoricals and the Academic Senate for California Community Colleges cuts, these in terms of the overall budget are very small numbers, yet they're drastic for those, specifically for those programs in those areas. And those are some of the ones that we'll be highlighting on top of other cuts as well that we'll be advocating to push back against as the process moves along. Some positive things I wanted to highlight. There's three, that's $1 million cut, not $1 billion cut. I think that's in my dreams that there's a $3 billion cut to Calbright. I apologize for the typo there. Clearly, I was projecting what I would like to see for Calbright. There are no cuts to EOPS or DSPS categoricals. Also, no cuts to the full-time faculty funding. There was specific funding in a few budget cycles, most recent budget cycles. That specific funding was not cut. So we were really happy to see that, as we had advocated very strongly on behalf of that funding to increase full-time faculty within our system. So we are really happy to see that stay. Again, there's continued support for the Promise program, which is something the governor has prioritized. And the Proposition 98 split is at 10.93%, excuse me. So that is that is what is traditionally applied to our system within Proposition 98, and that is something that we've advocated for in the past. That number has been altered and sometimes has disadvantaged our system. So we will be continuing to advocate to receive our full amount of the Proposition 98 split. Something else to keep in mind is that deferrals are a big component of how the state is going to be addressing the budget shortfall. This was the case during the last recession as well, and we will be seeing it in the next couple of budget years, at least here. So the deferral that we will see now will be $330 million that will be deferred from the current fiscal year that we are in to the next budget year. So there is a shortfall in the current fiscal year, and this deferral is essentially taking that shortfall and deferring the payments that were supposed to be made, which is $330 million, to the next budget year. And these deferral payments are applied for June of the fiscal year, but they are actually made in the following fiscal year. And then in 2021, in 2020, 2021, there'll be an even larger deferral of $662 million that will be moved to the subsequent fiscal year. There are also changes to how CalSTRS pensions will occur. So last year, within the current budget year, but it was proposed last year, and the fiscal year it was proposed last year, was $2.3 billion in funds that were going to be dedicated to paying schools long-term unfunded liability. Instead, that amount is going to be paid to pay the retirement contributions moving forward here. So for the next, moving forward, this amount that was supposed to be paid to pay down the long-term unfunded liability will now be shifted to help school employers pay for retirement contributions. So that's the districts. Additionally, there'll be a suspension of the annual rate increases that employers are supposed to pay until 2023-24. The budget process from here, we will now move to the legislature, who is holding a hearing. The first hearing on our issue area in the Assembly is going to be today at 2:30. We will be engaged in that conversation and making public comment, and we are meeting with the legislators that serve on that committee. The Senate will be meeting in a few days as well, early next week, to have their first hearing. So the governor's released his proposal. The Assembly and the Senate will do the same, and then they will come together and pass a budget together within conference committee and come to an agreement before June 15th, which is the budget deadline, the constitutional the budget deadline that must be followed. So the process moves really quick from here. Only a few more weeks away, and quite frankly, the agreements will be made before that. So we don't have much time to be engaged here and change. You know, I think one thing I will highlight is the deficit number that I mentioned before. That number may be different when the negotiations occur, and I'll touch on that a little bit earlier. But one unique thing that has affected this process is the income tax deadline being pushed back. So as you know, traditionally taxes are due on April 15th. They've been pushed to July 15th, and that impacts the ability of the state to understand the full picture of its revenue. So what that means is in August, there will be a potential revision or another review of the revenue, which may result in revenue being lower than what is being estimated now, which could result in changes to the budget in August or September. So what we see passed in June and signed in June potentially could change again in the late summer, early fall. So I think that's something that's really important to know. And because of that, districts have until October to adopt their local budgets. So everything kind of gets pushed back. And I think that's one piece of information we really wanted to share with you, is to understand how the calendar has changed and how that's going to affect you all locally. So here's some questions that we're waiting to kind of find out as we move through the process here, which is, what is the legislature going to use for its budget deficit numbers? I mentioned earlier the Department of Finance had the $54 billion number. However, around the same time, the Legislative Analyst Office, the nonpartisan office that provides research and recommendations to the legislature, said the deficit for the next budget year could be 18 to 31 billion. So a wide range there, but significantly lower than what the Department of Finance had indicated. So will the legislature decide that the budget deficit is smaller than what the administration thinks? And if so, that should mean less cuts than what we've seen so far in the May revise. So I share that with you now, and I want to emphasize this point, is that we still have a way to go before we're going to see what the final budget is. So what that means for all of you locally, if your districts are already proposing and trying to get commitments for certain cuts, certain things locally, that we still actually don't know what this is going to look like, and we won't for a little while longer. So I think it's wise and prudent to pay close attention to what happens over the next few weeks. And for all of you that are FACC members, you'll get that information from us, and take that with you, whether it's in contract negotiations or negotiations locally or anything like that, to make sure that you have this information and aren't making any commitments before we really have a final idea of what we're working on with the budget numbers. Again, will we have federal assistance? That's a big question. The governor and legislative leaders, congressional leaders here in California have again passed a bill through the House that would add significant support for our state. It is very unlikely that that bill is going to be successful. However, will there be some sort of compromise that will bring some sort of federal assistance? That will need to be determined before July to have for that to really be implemented within the budget, is my understanding. So we're going to see here quickly, hopefully, if that is something that will be benefiting our state. But we still have a ways to go, is my point. A lot of variables, but hopefully that gives you a pretty good overview of what we're looking at right now with the budget. So with that, we had some questions that were provided ahead of time, and our president, Debbie Klein, will be sharing those questions, and I will be responding to them.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Hi, Evan. All right, thank you. Can everyone hear me all right? All right, so looks like, am I getting an echo? I'll go ahead with the first question. So reading the news and hearing from students, it's safe to assume that several students who are planning to take courses at a four-year university will be taking courses at a community college since the courses are cheaper. Along these lines, is FACC planning to work to direct more funding to community colleges to address the needs of our students, which will ultimately be beneficial for our economy? And that came from
Great.
Emily Haroldson at Glendale. Thanks, Emily.
Great. Thank you for the question. Can you all still hear me, Debbie? Okay, great. Thank you. I had to switch back to my headphones. So thank you for the question. And that's a question I've heard from quite a few folks over the last week or so. Again, I think a lot of what I've heard is anecdotal, to be sure, but it seems to make some sense. If you have a student who was intending to enroll at a four-year, and they have seen that their CSU, for example, is going to be online in the fall, and of course there's questions beyond that, will those students come to our community colleges? And I think it's a fair question, and it has been part of our conversations that we've had so far. And additionally, historically during recessions, our community college enrollment has increased and increased significantly. So from FACC's perspective, at least, we do expect to see that increased demand. And we are advocating that the legislature prepares for this. We don't want to have the same mistake that we had 10 years ago when we were turning away so many students. We really don't want to have that again. We were turning away tens of thousands of students. I think we appreciate that the governor has acknowledged that access and equity should be a focus here with the remaining dollars. However, we appreciate that and understand that when you dramatically cut the system as is being proposed, that has an impact as well. So we are certainly going to, first and foremost, advocate on behalf of prioritizing our funding with the expectation that we will see increased demand within our system. So to answer the question, yes, absolutely. We will be doing so, and we will be making that point specifically that was shared in the question. I know that there was talk. This has not entered the conversation of policy making quite yet, but certainly I've heard it from some of the other stakeholders, which is if our system ends up seeing increased demand and the UCs and CSUs end up seeing less demand, would there be a consideration of a shift of funding as we are serving more students to be able to supplement us to do so? I don't know if that would happen. Certainly, you know, as an organization, we don't want to see any of our higher education systems, public higher education systems, face any cuts. But nonetheless, I think we expect to serve the most students as we do as a system, and we expect to serve even more students, and we expect the legislature will appropriately fund our system to meet that and serve every student who comes to our community colleges.
Thanks, Evan. I'll go ahead and read the next question. And this is from someone who wants to remain anonymous. What does the proposed 7.3 million reduction for part-time faculty compensation entail? No salary increase as negotiated by the union, a cut in the number of staff or the number of hours, the implementation of FTEs during COVID instruction?
Thank you. And just to reiterate, I mean, we are incredibly disheartened by these cuts to part-time faculty support. We had worked really hard to ensure that within the messaging from the system that part-time faculty would be prioritized. And the Chancellor's office drafted it and wrote a letter and sent a letter to the governor and legislature on behalf of many system stakeholders, many districts, all the faculty groups. And that letter had support for part-time faculty prioritized. And that is something that we were heartened to see. And we are obviously very disheartened to see cuts falling on the back of our part-time faculty. Again, it will depend on what is happening locally. The part-time faculty compensation fund is used by districts to do, as the name suggests, for part-time faculty to assist with compensation. And oftentimes it's sort of a reimbursement of what the local districts are doing. Having said that, it was already grossly underfunded before these proposed cuts. The compensation fund was at 25 million. And as part-time faculty are the most faculty within our system, that number was not able to have a significant impact or an impact that we would like to see at the state level on pay equity and the goals that we share as an organization for our part-time faculty. And we also acknowledge and want to appreciate that our part-time faculty have done so much during this time that they haven't been compensated for, with transitioning their courses remotely or online. So if anything, in an ideal world, we're increasing this fund to compensate our part-time faculty for that work. Unfortunately, this isn't the ideal world with this massive budget deficit. Now, having said that, you know, we don't believe that these cuts are necessary. A little bit more than $7 million for both of these cuts. We think that could easily be offset by a $7 million cut to Calbright, for example. Calbright's only facing a $3 million cut. If you cut it by $7 million, they would still have $10 million left to serve the 500 students that they serve, as opposed to the part-time faculty who are teaching, you know, the million students plus that, you know, they serve. So for us, it doesn't make much sense. That's a message that we're going to state earlier on. Again, a $3 million cut dispersed to the districts will have an effect, as the question mentioned, but a lot of that will rely on what happens locally, as there's less money now for part-time compensation that you will see locally within your district. So I just want to assure the person who wrote this question and all of you on the call that pushing back against these cuts will be a top priority for FACC.
Thanks, Evan. And I'll just add, if I may, that our mantra as an organization regarding part-time faculty support has actually been received now by the Chancellor's office and our system partners. And now they are echoing what we are asking for, and it's 4 things. It's pay parity, paid office hours, paid professional development, and benefits. So we will continue to advocate for those 4 things regarding part-time faculty support. It's a huge priority for our organization. So
Debbie.
moving on to the final question that I have, Evan, it's also from someone anonymous. It's, could the hold harmless provision be eliminated? How do the proposed cuts to the funding formula affect the current hold harmless provision?
Thank you, Debbie. Yeah, so the hold harmless provision, certainly, everything is on the table. And I think this question came before, before I think there was an opportunity to really dive into what the proposal was in the May revise. But I can tell you that as what is included in the May revise does not have an elimination of the hold harmless provision. However, it does propose essentially a 10% cut across the hold harmless, or across the funding formula that will be proportional on each part of the funding formula. And that includes the hold harmless. So essentially, as the administration is looking at it now, it would be a 10% cut on top of the hold harmless. So for our districts that are in a hold harmless, that's a 10% cut. On top of that, again, that 10% is based off of the January proposal. It is essentially an 8% cut. Nonetheless, a significant cut, especially for our districts that are already in hold harmless. Our provision is to approach this a different way. Rather than take what we would call a punitive funding formula, which we have had a number of concerns about since it was implemented, and cut it 10% across the board to everybody, we think that we should have a proposal that focuses more on access, as the governor has indicated should be the priority, and removes the performance-based funding allocation, which is approximately 10% of it, so our districts can focus on access and not focus on competing with each other for scarce resources during this economic downturn. Now, we understand that affects all the districts differently. We understand that this funding formula, no matter what change you make to it, is going to impact some districts different than it's going to impact others. That is the flaw with our funding formula, and it's created, I think, many of the challenges that we've seen from it. But in this environment where we have a deficit, where we expect to have an increase in students, we want to make sure that we're funded in a way that is focusing on access. So, our proposal would be certainly less harmful for the hold harmless districts, and that is our goal moving forward, is to ensure that no district faces these drastic sort of cuts that would put them potentially on the path to, a fiscal cliff being right in front of them. So this is something that's incredibly important to our organization. We're going to be making this a priority as we're moving forward. I think a piece of good news to add to this is that there were 2 years of additional hold harmless added on the back end of the funding formula. However, if the hold harmless is reduced, it's not as significant as hold harmless as it was just a few months ago, for example. But nonetheless, that extension, if we are able to get back to an economic reality that's a little bit more normal, will be very helpful once we get there. So hopefully that answers the question. I know that's not a great answer. For those of you that are in districts that are being held harmless, this is a significant concern, but it's something that we're focusing on.
Thanks, Evan. And I just wanted to let you and the other folks know that from here, the staff will be taking the questions and you'll be receiving them through the chat.
Great, thank you.
Hey, Evan, hey, everybody.
Sorry. Thank you, Stephanie. Go for it.
Stephanie Goldman here. I'll be reading out the questions from the chat. We did get one question via email today. What specifically can individual faculty do now before the budget is finalized in June to mitigate the budget cuts on community colleges?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And we are trying to get all of our faculty members involved and engaged in this work. I think, one of the advantages we have as a system is our sheer numbers, right? And also the fact that our community colleges are going to play such a significant role in combating this public health crisis, but also being the engine for an economic recovery. And so I think we're well positioned to make the argument for our system. Now, we understand that as a system, we're fighting against other programs and other important expenditures that are critical for our state as well and critical for doing those things. But we really believe that now is the time to engage with our legislators and our policymakers to support our system. So at the very end of today, I'm going to share some specifics to answer that question in terms of how individual members can engage with the legislature, because I think that's really the most important piece right now. But on top of that, I think, and I know this may sound insignificant, but our community colleges are key to our community and our community members who utilize them. I think for those of you, your neighbors, your friends in your community, to share with them what our community colleges do, what these impacts would mean for their community, for students, I think is important. A lot of this is educational as well. These cuts will have significant impact, and sometimes that is lost in the numbers and the stories and the news with everything else going on. I think it's important, as we will see opportunities in the future, whether it's locally through parcel taxes or statewide with initiatives to increase revenues for our community college system, that we have an understanding that our community colleges are critical. They were already underfunded. They're going to be even more underfunded, and that needs to change. So again, sort of just being an ambassador yourself in your community. Again, I know it sounds small, but it really is significant. And then being engaged with your policymakers. FACC has action alerts that makes this really easy to do. I'll share some of those at the end of the call, but you can find them on our website. If everybody can engage in those action alerts on behalf of funding our system and supporting our students, that'll make a big impact.
Thanks, Evan. What is Calbright's budget?
So Calbright's budget is the following. So when they were created, they initially were given $100 million one time that they could spend over 7 years. And that was just one-time funding, again, to help them with sort of startup costs and things of that nature. And then they were also allocated $20 million ongoing, to which they've been allocated $40 million already. So that's $140 million in total that they've already been allocated. And within the governor's proposal, there's an additional $17 million now moving forward. So that $17 million is essentially a 15% cut from what they were previously receiving as a college. So having said that, they have not spent a lot of their the money that they've already been allocated. In fact, they've spent very little of it. Again, they serve very few students. So from our perspective, you're talking about the 2.1 million and potentially growing amount of students that we're going to have in our system versus the 500 in Calbright. It really seems that there should not be cuts that would affect those 2.1 million students if we are able to utilize the funding to help offset any of those cuts from the funding that Calbright receives. So that is the amount of budget that Calbright gets. Again, I'll let some of you do the math of 500 students, compared to the $140 million that the college has received. It's certainly a much higher per student funding than the rest of our colleges have. So again, I think for us, we're in the time where we need to focus on priorities, and we don't see Calbright as being a priority.
All right, we had another participant ask, what about raising revenue by taxing the wealth or income of the top 1% in California?
Yeah, so we were a proud supporter. So right after the last recession in 2012 on the ballot was Proposition 30, which did do this, which was an income tax increase on the very wealthy in our state, and it passed. And it was critical to providing funding for our system. I mean, absolutely critical. And it was the first time that a tax increase had been passed for voters in California in quite some time, I think, in modern political history. And certainly, I think there need to be discussions around, tax reform in this state and increasing revenues, particularly for education in this state. What I would say that, any sort of proposal that's out there is something that we would consider. I think increasing revenues during this time, I think, is critical. I would just like to highlight one that may not be specifically getting to your question, but I think it's really critical, is the Schools and Communities First Act, which will be on the ballot in November. And essentially, this would amend the commercial tax component of Proposition 13 to provide more revenue for our community colleges and education and communities in general. So this is something that FACC and many other organizations have supported. It would bring a tremendous amount of resources into our system as an investment to bolster our community colleges and allow us to continue to do the amazing work that we do on behalf of our students and on behalf of the state of California. Again, I mean, our community colleges, and I think the voters of California understand this, are vital to our system. And I believe that the voters are ready to, support efforts to reinvest and increase investment within our community college system. And I think that's one opportunity here that we're going to have right in front of us coming down the road in a November election. So I would encourage all of you to educate yourself now on the initiative. Certainly it's going to be, I think, a challenge as we move forward in an election cycle for that to be successful, but nonetheless, it's something that I encourage you all to look into and hopefully join us in support, as that'll be a crucial, I think, component, and not only during this economic downturn, but also moving forward for an investment within our community college system.
Great, thank you. The main rationale for downsizing the community colleges by about 500,000 students over the last decade was the job market is so wonderful, students prefer to go to work rather than college. Now, during the pandemic, about 1/3 of young people have been laid off, but still no money for enrollment growth. This is downsizing of college access where the economy is good or bad. How is FACC advocating about downsizing?
Yeah, no, it's exactly right. And hopefully I mentioned this earlier on to sort of make the connection to exactly that point. I mean, that is right. Again, historically, and we don't believe there's any reason why this would be different. Yes, we understand that obviously this is an unprecedented situation we're in. Having courses online, I think, does impact people's thoughts of enrolling in college. There's no doubt about it. And we could spend time talking about how online and remote instruction is challenging for many of our students who maybe don't have access to, internet, computers, all these sort of things that are crucial. And certainly that's a conversation we're engaged in as well. But nonetheless, I think our community colleges will continue to be looked at as a place where, as you mentioned, these soon to be hopefully community college students will turn to when the economy has a downturn to gain the credentials, the education, whatever their educational goal may be, to come to our community colleges and put themselves in a place to be able to, when the economy returns back to normal, to be able to enter into the job market in a way that is what their educational and career goals are. And that's what our systems do, community college system does, and it's what we do really well. So I think, honestly, we are going to be making that a top priority. We have continued to do so to talk about the fact that we do expect these students to return. And I'll be honest with you, there are some that don't think that that'll be the case, that think that we won't see the increased demand that we might have seen in other recessions. And what we have been trying to do is collect as much data as possible to try to make that case. So for any of you that are on the webinar right now, it would be helpful if you could share any information of what enrollment numbers look like, even for the summer within your district. And if you could share that with us, that helps us make that argument to state policymakers. Anecdotally, I've heard some very large numbers of what enrollment is looking like in the summer in terms of an increase. I've also heard the other side as well, but not as much, where they've seen less enrollment. However, it would be important for us to have all of that data and have it actually right now at this moment in time. So for any of you that are listening at your college, if you know what your enrollment numbers are, where they're looking at like in the summer, and even if you're able to have any idea in the fall, send us an email at info@facc.org, and that'll be critical for us being able to be successful with that argument. But the point in the question is the right one, and it's the same argument we're going to be making. And we really, we're going to do whatever we can to convince our policymakers to understand that, which ultimately will mean that there has to be a priority in funding within our system to be able to meet those students when we do have the final budget, whenever that is determined.
As a follow-up to the earlier part-time question, in this person's district, the initial reaction to the crisis budget cuts was to reduce classes offered so as not to overspend their part-time funding. Are there any efforts being made to allow more flexibility in funding part-time faculty salaries if the need to meet student demands means more classes, not fewer, or what is needed? Yeah, no, that's a great question. And again, just to reiterate this, I mean, we don't see, this budget deficit shouldn't fall
on the backs of our part-time faculty. It's what we saw during the last recession. We are adamant about this point. And at the end of the day, as I've mentioned a few times, if the administration is wanting to ensure that we are focusing on access and meeting the demand of students coming to our community college system, then our part-time faculty are going to have to be there to teach those students and offer those courses when those students do come back. That's the reality of it. So it would be short-sighted to make those decisions right now, certainly, to not offer courses to part-time faculty. Now, the question about flexibility, I mean, look, yeah, we want to see funding to be able to support our part-time faculty. It doesn't necessarily have to come from those categoricals, right? I mean, those are just there to sort of help with this, but nonetheless, we believe that it should be a priority, and therefore there are other parts of the budget. And again, a lot of this will need to occur locally as well, where our part-time faculty can be supported from. So, we are certainly advocating those points. Again, despite that, we really do feel that these cuts to the part-time faculty categoricals are inappropriate. We understand that they, will not, even if we're able to push back against those, we understand that that's not going to necessarily get us to where we want to be when it comes to this issue. But nonetheless, the intention around protecting both those categoricals, but even moving forward on this issue is something that we will be focusing on and prioritizing.
Thank you. The Student-Centered Funding Formula Oversight Committee is presently discussing, among other things, how the SCIF might be adjusted in the event of a recession. Are they going to have time to be able to make a recommendation to the legislature in time to have any impact on what happens for the fiscal year 2021?
I don't think so. To be honest with you, I don't think so. I mean, the governor already came out with, essentially what the administration's proposal is on the funding formula during a recession. The legislature is working on that right now, and we'll probably have, recommendations here very soon. The Oversight Committee meets on Friday, and they're not going to be done on Friday. So I think FACCC has been engaged in the Oversight Committee for well over a year now, attending every meeting, trying to engage and persuade the committee to consider our proposals when it comes to all the different things that they considered within the funding formula. They were initially tasked with coming up with a proposal on the funding formula if a recession occurs from the very beginning. And now, obviously, when the Oversight Committee was created, again, the very beginning being about a year and a half ago or so, when they started their work, no one anticipated we would be where we're at right now. I can appreciate the fact that, this has jumped up on everybody, and the opportunity to be able to sort of, thoroughly research and do simulations on what the impact of cuts would be to districts, unfortunately, isn't going to be possible during this time crunch that we have. So the Oversight Committee, while I expect, and I'm not sure, will continue to do their work, perhaps they come up with a proposal that can be used in the future to adjust in future budget years, but I do not anticipate that it is going to be able to have a recommendation in time for the budget to be passed in June. However, again, as I mentioned, there's a possibility of August and September revisions, and perhaps some of their recommendations could be included then. But the legislature and governor are going to have an idea very soon here on how to change the funding formula during a recession. And the Oversight Committee, I don't believe, is going to be able to have some sort of final recommendations before then.
Okay. Given the short time frame to make an argument for increasing investment in the California community colleges, how is data about summer enrollment being collected and shared with legislators to show the significant role community colleges have?
Yeah, great question. I touched on that a little bit earlier. That's something that we're working on. Again, it's a lot easier. I mean, the advantage we have is having members at every single college. So we try to utilize that when we can. And I think this is a good example to where we can just hear from our members and tell us what they're seeing locally. and that's going to be a huge impact. So we're literally in the Capitol the next 2 days all day. And when I say literally, that's not the correct word at all. Virtually is the right word. We're going to be virtually doing lobby visits the next 2 days. And having that data would be incredibly helpful to make that argument that we're attempting to make. So again, I'll just repeat what I said earlier. For those of you that have that data accessible, please share that at info@facc.org. And I'm going to put the email up on the screen here in a minute so you can see it. Share that information with us, and then we can get that information out. As I mentioned, we've been doing a bit of this already, but to the extent that we can get as many of the colleges as possible, to have that data from as many of the colleges as possible, will make us allow us to be a lot more effective in the lobby visits that we're about to have tomorrow and the following day.
If we are anticipating an increase of students in the community colleges, is there a possibility that the community college tuition will be reduced to accommodate students who may not be able to afford it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And many of our students right now are receiving free tuition either through through the Promise program, used to be called the Board of Governors waiver, or just in general, right? The college Promise offers free tuition for all students. I think what we have seen, and this is a very important point, the tuition, or the fees, are only a component of what the cost is for a student to attend community colleges, to attend our community colleges. The cost of housing, the cost of food, the cost of books, all those sort of things are really even much more, of higher pressure points when it comes to sort of financial barriers for our students. And unfortunately, there aren't any proposals to increase the assistance with that. Now, we are happy to see that there, at the moment, doesn't appear to be any cuts to financial aid, at least in the state, for our community college students. That's helpful. But unfortunately, that needed to be expanded to meet the need for our students. So while fees, I think, will likely be where they're at because of the College Promise program, the other expenditures are something that are, is going to be, continue to be a barrier, and especially now during this time of economic uncertainty and a recession. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. We have our sponsored legislation, Assembly Bill 2884, which hopes to allow, but not mandate, that restricted funds from lottery funds for the districts can be used to help with these sort of needs, with basic needs for our students. So we're trying to do what we can to find new pots of revenue for our students. But essentially, we were having a very hard time meeting this need before the recession. It's only going to be even more challenging. So I think the focus around this, I think, is something that needs, is going to need some action. Again, during the recession, even more so. I think it just puts an emphasis on it. But in general, it's something that our system's going to have to focus on. And to the questions that were raised earlier about increasing revenue, I think that's going to be a big component for this issue as well.
Thanks, Evan. And that's all the questions we've received so far.
Great, thank you. So that gives me a little bit more time to do the wrap up here and the next steps. So as I shared earlier, the action alerts are a really easy way, the FACC action alerts, to get involved and advocate for yourself to your legislators that represent you. And we have a couple of them right now on our website, so I'd encourage you to go to facc.org to see them on there and to engage. We make it really easy. Excuse me. You will put in your name, your address, so we can determine what district you're in, and your phone number, if you would like to, communicate with them. But your email address is really the most important part, because right now, as many of you are experiencing locally, the Capitol is also working remotely. They have probably one staffer at a time in the office. So if you're calling the office, you're likely going to get an answering machine. So we're intending to get as many emails to our legislators as possible. And we've created a form letter that is really easy for all of you to use. And you can get that message across really quickly to our legislators. It takes literally 60 seconds. So we hope you engage in that. The goal here is sort of a numbers game. It's to flood the inboxes with messages about supporting our community colleges. Additionally, the stakeholder groups in the Chancellor's office are leading sort of a social media campaign, #SupportCCC Education. We also, through our action alert, can set you up with a Twitter message. You can add that hashtag and be engaged in the social media conversation. That is a big part of this as well. Certainly a lot of the traditional means we would have for the sort of grassroots advocacy are unavailable during a public health crisis. So that raises the necessity for social media and email conversations and engagement in this effort. We do encourage you all locally within your district, if you're able to also engage with your legislators locally within their district offices. Now, I doubt that you're able to necessarily visit them at this time, but my expectation is we'll have a little bit more capacity for phone calls. So I think those are some things that really think about when you're talking about engaging and how you can have an impact on supporting our system and adding your voice to the fight for protecting our funding. And one thing I want to share is just to be vigilant locally. Again, I've heard, and I can't appreciate the perspective, but I've heard from a lot of our members locally who tell us that their local administration is sort of, saying already indicating certain cuts, certain reductions that they'll need to make, and they want to make those decisions right now. And those decisions may, fall on the back of, as we were mentioning earlier, part-time faculty, for example, maybe categorical, certain programs. I think for you all to be vigilant, as an organization, we want to provide you all with as much information and data to be empowered locally, because, our system it's a system between the state and the local aspect of it. We fight really hard and such an important role, and the funding and everything comes from the state. But there is an important role locally, and a big part of what we want to do as an organization is empower all our local leaders. And you can be empowered with just the information we're providing. So just be vigilant. I would say be prepared to, push back against certain proposed cuts. That, if you, understand that there are, the budget picture, there's a lot of variables, there's a lot of things that could happen in the next few weeks. So don't make any decisions based off of what you're hearing right now, and continue to engage with us on getting information and data that can be helpful to make those decisions locally. Again, we want to continue to have these conversations and have these budget webinars during this time. We had, I think, at a high point, a little bit over 100 participants. We had about 200 register, so we understand that there is a demand here. We'll have another budget webinar once the budget is passed in June, and that'll give you the sort of, I'll say final, but as I mentioned, there could be revisions later, but give you an idea of what the budget's looking like at that moment in time. And I think that's going to be critical for the decisions that will be made locally. So we will provide that final update. The budget will, I suspect, look different than what the proposals are looking like now. So certainly we will send that information out. So, keep an eye on the weekly and our website for information about that. It'll be in the middle of June, roughly probably a month from now. If you have any questions that we weren't able to get to, please send those questions to info@facc.org. The email is there on your screen. Additionally, as I mentioned earlier, any information that you have about enrollment numbers that you think would be helpful, please send them to that email address as well. And then finally, some other, we wanted to highlight that we're working very closely with all the different stakeholder groups, and especially our student leaders. The Student Senate for California Community Colleges has done great work advocating for students across our system. They have a town hall webinar coming up on Wednesday at 12 o'clock. We would encourage you all, so tomorrow at 12 o'clock, we'd encourage you all to join. The information's on their website, ssccc.org. We encourage you to join and be engaged in that webinar. To sort of hear the perspective of our students and the work that they're doing on support of our system as well. So that was all that I had. Debbie, did you have any final thoughts for us?
Thanks, Evan. I just wanted to thank everyone for being here today and for all of your advocacy work and your vigilance during this time. We are with you. We love you, and we are definitely here to advocate on behalf of our faculty and our students in this next month. It's a high season of advocacy for us, and we are on it, and we can use your feedback along the way. So please don't hesitate to reach out and let us know your ideas and how we can support you.
Thank you. And I have one final question since we have 6 minutes to mention, because it's important, and I couldn't agree more. Someone shared that they would ask that we no longer use the word student-centered funding formula, and that is something that we are very cognizant of, and typically I avoid it unless it's being written that way, specifically like in statute. So for context, if I need to, and that's kind of why I used it earlier today. That's how it's listed, unfortunately, within the actual budget language when you look at it. But nonetheless, it's a very misleading terminology. So I couldn't agree more with that. So again, I want to emphasize Debbie's remarks. Thank you so much for all of your work, for everything you do. We know how hard you all are working locally. We know the transition to remote to online instruction has not been easy. We appreciate that within our system, many of our leaders recognize all the hard work that's being put in right now, and we hope that that isn't lost when these decisions are made. And when we can promise you that we are sharing that, and sharing your stories and sharing everything that you're doing locally with our policymakers, so they know how hard you're working right now on behalf of our students. So just wanted to make sure you all knew that. Again, I want to thank you all for taking the time to be on this webinar. I hope you'll join us in about a month for our next webinar. And otherwise, again, thank you for your time, and we'll talk to you all soon.